Well, good morning, church. I just had to say that, even though it might not be morning, it could be afternoon or evening. A lot of you would know that that's the way I used to introduce a lot of my lessons, because it was often morning. We gather together on the first day of the week and see everyone on a Sunday morning. And it's a little bit weird. We're still here during COVID and isolation, but on behalf of the Waterloo congregation, whatever time of day it is or whatever day of the week it might be for you, we just want to welcome you and hope that this message is a blessing to you in your life in this week ahead. Some of you may not know this, but I used to wear a baseball cap almost all the time. I wore a baseball cap, this is one of the things, especially when I had my motorcycle, take the helmet off and the hat would go on, and I'd tuck it right down in my jacket. I had it with me all the time, and I'd wear it all the time. And I remember this one time I was out with my father-in-law. We were at a wedding, and we were in Sarnia, and I was sitting down for breakfast at just a little diner. It was nothing particularly special. And the server came up to me, and she said, "Sir, I will not serve you unless you take that hat off." And I was kind of taking it for a little surprise and a little embarrassed, Maybe you found yourself in a situation where you've been called out and you've been in a situation where you've been embarrassed in front of others, maybe rejected. Sometimes that happens to us. Maybe you can think back, it's probably happened to all of us at one time. Maybe it was in high school when you were picked last for a sports team. Or maybe you applied for that position and you told your friends and your family you're pretty sure you were shoo-in for that position. You had more experience and there was no one else as qualified, but someone else ended up getting the job, and how embarrassing that would be, and just that feeling of rejection and shame. Or maybe you can think of a time when your coworkers were going out together and you were excited, but you didn't get the invitation. And maybe you even approached them and said, "Hey," or your friends or family, and you said, hey, that sounds good, I'm going to come. And maybe they blatantly told you, no, this is not for you. Maybe they told you nicely, but you still knew that you were rejected. Rejection is not something easy, especially when we know that need for acceptance and belonging is one of the basic needs of humanity. And the people will do almost anything to feel accepted and to feel their place in that place of belonging. But as a Christian, being rejected is something that kind of comes with the package. You have to be willing to be rejected, or at least anticipate that you're going to be rejected at some place in some way. Jesus foretold that. Jesus warns us. In John chapter 15, verse 18, Jesus said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." Following God's not always easy, and there's a long history of those who had followed God who had found themselves rejected, even by other believers, even by those other people of God who they were rejected from their own people. One person I'd like to take some time to look into is the life of David. If you haven't read the life of David recently, I encourage you to go through and just start in maybe 1 Samuel chapter 17 and maybe even go back to 16 and just follow it through the book of 1 Samuel 17 or 16 and following. David was rejected multiple times. We think of David here as a man after God's own heart. Every king was compared to David. We think, well, what did David know about rejection? He went from being a shepherd boy to being a king, not just any king, but a king that all the other kings were compared to, and one that Jesus would be a descendant of. But yet, David understood rejection. Even right back to when he was anointed. It's interesting that when here Samuel comes to his family, and he comes to his father Jesse, and all the brothers are brought, the 7 brothers are brought to Samuel, and at the end, God's like, it's not any of these people, not any of these guys. And Samuel says to Jesse, "Is there anyone else?" Almost as if David wasn't even being considered. And finally Jesse said, "Well, there's one more, but he's out in the fields, and we'll go and get him." There's some allusion in other texts outside of the Bible that suggest that David had some hardships when he was a lot of rejection, family rejection, and things like that. Bible doesn't say that specifically. We don't know a lot about the early life of David from Scripture, but we do know that David faced rejection afterward. We know that David was the one who fought Goliath. Now, what did that mean? To us, it's a kid's story. To us, it's a story we tell all the time, maybe one we're quite familiar with. But to the Israelite, do you know what that meant? You see, Goliath stood there, and instead of these two, Israel versus the Philistine, instead of these two nations going to war and all these deaths and bloodshed, needless bloodshed and everything, Goliath said, "You choose one person. If that one person can defeat me, then we will be your servants. But if I defeat them, then you will be our servants." Do you know what that means? That means that everyone in Israel If David failed to defeat Goliath, everyone in Israel would be a slave or a servant of the Philistines. So they were all indebted to David. No one else was willing to step forward, and no one else could have done it. But David did it. David stepped forward, defeated the giant, and he saved the people. And you know what gratitude he got for that? David was rejected. After saving the people, David was rejected. So he comes back from his conquests, and Saul put the fighting men and David in charge of fighting men, and everything David did, God's hand was with him. He was impressed Saul, he impressed all the people so much they knew that God was with him. But yet, when he came back into town, and the people came out of the town, and they're singing this song, Saul has slain his thousands, David tens of thousands, Saul became jealous. And just like that, Saul put a bounty on David's head. And you would think that those people who knew what David did for them, that the fighting men, the warriors that were side by side with David, that were working with him and watching what he did and knew what he did that day, you would think they would say, no, Saul, this is wrong. But they didn't. They followed Saul to hunt down David. And David found himself alone. David found himself on the run. David found himself actually hiding in a cave at one point. He's at the cave of Adullam. And there it says that 400 others came to be with him, to be his men. And do you know who they were? They weren't the big warriors who were standing beside him fighting against the Philistines. They were the ones, we're told, who were in debt, who were discontented, or the ones who were in distress. I mean, these seemed like they were the ones who were rejected themselves. And they came to be at David's side. And then David finds himself on the run. Even his own family, he sends them away to live with another nation, the Moabites. He's worried for even his own family. And then we see that David and his men, they end up in the hill country, in the forest, and they're watching over these sheep. And here comes a story of Nabal and Abigail. And you might remember that story. And David sends some men, they're guarding his sheep, and the men come to Nabal, and Nabal says, who is David? He insults him. David protected him. David saved him from being a slave, from losing all of his wealth. David saved all that wealth that he would have lost to the Philistines. And yet he couldn't share just a little bit with David and his men. Instead, he shares an insult. Who is this David? I know lots of slaves who are running away from their masters. Rejected once again. David becomes a son-in-law of Saul. Saul tries to kill him by pinning him with a spear to the wall, and then he gets his daughter Michal and tries to use her to have David killed. And even in his sleep, David sent some men in to carry the bed to him so he could kill him when he thought that David was sick. And David had to be let out of a window. David was rejected again and again and again for many years. And even in his older years, when he finds his son who's grown up, Absalom, trying to tear the kingdom from him. Because of David's own sin, of course, we know that this is what God's judgment was, but still, he's barefoot, he's walking, and one of the descendants of Saul, Shimei, is spitting and cursing him and reminding him of how lowly he is. And yet David accepts these insults, but he's rejected once again, even from his own palace. David understood rejection. So why are we talking about David? Well, David was God's anointed. You see, we think sometimes that when we give our lives to Christ, when we become Christians, that everything's going to be fine, that everything's going to go well, and that, you know what, now that I've got God on my side, my life's going to be just a bowl of cherries, everything will be fine. But often that's not what we find. Sometimes things might even get more difficult, because we have to remember that there are forces at work that are working against us, to discourage us, to pull us away from God, to get us to turn our backs on God. And so, David was rejected. Joseph was rejected. All he tried to do was reveal some dreams and convey what God had told him to his brothers, and he's rejected. He's sold into slavery, almost killed. Moses was rejected. God sent him. All he did was obey God to go and to tell the Egyptians to let my people go. And God's own people, it seemed that at first Moses feels alone, and then even in the wilderness, they turn on Moses. And Elijah, feeling all alone. After he goes to turn their hearts back to God, and Elijah is rejected. Over and over and over, we see that the prophets were rejected, and finally, the anointed one, the Messiah, God's only Son, was rejected. John says in John chapter 1, verse 11, He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. See, even Jesus was rejected. Jesus in his hometown. Jesus said as he goes to his hometown, this is found in Mark chapter 6, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. And we read in John 7, verse 5, for even his own brothers did not believe in him. Jesus knew rejection. It was prophesied that Messiah would be rejected, and he was. He was rejected in his hometown, rejected by his own family, rejected by the religious leaders who were looking forward to him coming. And they were the ones that tried to arrest him and ultimately had him arrested, put on trial, and handed over to the Romans to be crucified. And there's the crowds turning against him as they say, we have no king but Caesar. Crucify him, crucify him. Jesus knew rejection. And in that same verse, in John chapter 15, when Jesus said, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Do you know a little bit further on in that 2 verses later, Jesus said, remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. But then he says, if they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. Jesus reminds us that who we're following. Reminds us that it's not going to be easy following him. You see, we're following Jesus, and in following Jesus, we are to be lights to the world. And being a light in a dark place, it exposes the deeds done in darkness. Being a light in a dark place, all the eyes kind of turn to us. Just by very nature, we're not different for the sake of being different. We're different because of who we follow. And because of that, people aren't going to like it. Some people will listen, but some people aren't going to want us around because we're not going to make them feel comfortable. Even by very nature, in our repentance, saying we're not going to do that anymore, we've changed direction. When we stop doing the things that we once did or the things that the world thinks is okay, just by not doing it in and of itself, some people feel judged. And that's kind of what's happening. We're highlighting morality. We're highlighting ethics and morality. We're highlighting good, what good and evil is. We're showing them because God has taught us. See, the world has a hard time with good and evil. If there's no God, how do you even decide what's right and wrong? Just might makes right or whatever the government says. We have a real problem when it comes to morality. So when we say, no, God has shown us what's right, Jesus shows the way, some people are going to disagree and some people aren't going to like it. And in doing so, they're going to feel judged. Some may listen, some may listen and turn around. Some, on the other hand, may not want you around them because you don't make them feel good. Peter talks about this. You know, in Acts chapter 4, Peter quotes what Jesus quoted when he told a parable. And that parable is the parable of the vineyard, the owner of the vineyard. And Jesus tells this parable in Matthew. And in Matthew chapter 21. I'm not going to read it all, but I encourage you to read it maybe this week. But in Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 to 46, Jesus says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, and he put a wall around it, and he dug a wine press in it, and he built a watchtower, and then he rented the vineyard out to some tenants, some farmers, who moved, and then he moved to another place. Okay, so there's some tenants, some farmers taking care of this land. But finally, when the harvest is ready, this landowner, he sends some of his servants to go and get, his portion of the harvest. But these tenants don't want to give it up. They've been living there and it's comfortable for them and they like it. They've forgotten that it's not their property, that they're just renters. They're just farmers there. They don't own it. And so they torture and beat and stone and kill some of these servants. And so the landowner can't believe this and he sends more servants and they do the same. Finally, the landowner says, you know what? I'm going to send my son. Surely they will respect my son. But what do they say? They said, look, there's the heir coming. Let's kill him so that we may receive the inheritance. In other words, if there's no one left to give the inheritance to, maybe we'll be able to live here after the landowner dies. We've been here so long, this will just become ours. And of course, that's something that God says they'll have to answer for. God says they'll have to answer for. He says, what do you think will happen when the landowner comes? What do you think he will do? And he says, basically, those people are in big trouble. He calls them wretches. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end. Verse 41. And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at the harvest time. He was talking there specifically to the religious leaders of the day, the religious leaders who thought that they were in charge, who thought they kind of forgot about God's hand in all of this. And that's easy for us to do as well if we're not careful. But in this parable, Jesus quotes this. We read in verse 42, Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in Scripture, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes." The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Peter quotes this in Acts chapter 4, and Peter also quotes it in his letter when we read in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 10. We see that Peter quotes, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone." Now, to us, a cornerstone, what's a cornerstone? Cornerstone is the stone that is meticulously cut. It's usually the biggest stone, the most important stone that the builders would put for that foundation. Because this cornerstone, all the other measurements, all the other angles, and everything else was based on this stone. So if this stone was off even a little bit, the whole building would be in trouble. So this stone had to be cut just perfect, had to be set perfectly. This stone dictated what the rest of the building would look like. This was an important stone. And if you did not have this cornerstone in place, or it was a flawed cornerstone, you're living in an unstable house. And that's what Peter reminds us of. We need not worry about trying to please our neighbors and friends. We shouldn't be worried about that. We shouldn't be worried about trying to be popular or famous, or to get that acceptance and belonging from the world. We should be looking to please God. We should be looking to spend our gifts and our abilities to please God, because He provided us the cornerstone. And that's what Peter is saying to us. Peter says, he quotes this passage, and he says, "They stumble because they disobey the message." And this is verse 8 of 1 Peter chapter 2. "Which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light." And just before that, at the beginning of this passage, he says, "As you come to Him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God, and precious to Him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood." You see what Peter's saying? That we follow Jesus, that we are connected when we come into the church, when we accept Christ, when we give our lives to Him, we become His disciples, we become living stones. We're not the cornerstone, but when we accept Him as the cornerstone, then our life is being built perfectly in the kingdom. It might not look right on earth, it might not look like things are going well, but we need to trust God and know that when we're a part of His house, when we're part of His kingdom, that everything will be okay. No matter what things look like, in the end, if God is for us, who can be against us? When Paul was going through some difficult times, not only were the prophets and not only was Jesus persecuted, not only were the apostles persecuted, the apostle Paul was persecuted here as well. And he's going through a difficult time, and he's got this thorn in his flesh in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And he pleads with God to take it away from him, and God's answer is, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Sometimes those persecutions happen. They don't always happen for the same reasons. There's different reasons why Jesus was persecuted, why others were persecuted. But know that if God is on your side, whatever's happening, God can work it out for the good. And in the end, God's going to take care of you. God's going to make sure that you are cared for, that you are provided for, and that you are on solid ground as a part of His house, part of His kingdom. And so those who are living in the world, we need to try and teach them that if they don't have Jesus as their cornerstone, the house that they are a part of, the house that they're building, everything they're working for is temporary. Everything they're working for is one day going to collapse without that cornerstone, which was rejected in the past and unfortunately has been rejected since. But we need to teach them that they too have been invited to be a part of God's kingdom, God's house. We don't think we're better. We don't think we're better than them. We teach them that we have followed Christ. And that's what we're trying to do with the Waterloo Church here. Follow, disciple, share. We have followed. We become disciples, learners, and we're trying to share with others that God wants the same for them. Follow, disciple, share. And in the end, our job is to point to the house that Jesus built and to let them know that Jesus is the only way, and he wants to be their cornerstone as well.